Oscar stood by the huge windows of his luxurious apartment. The city lights twinkled brightly in the night, but he felt no joy in looking at them. At 38, Oscar, deep down inside, he felt lonely. He had tried to start a family twice, but both marriages had failed. Each time it had left a new wound in his heart, and in the end, he had decided not to trust anyone anymore. Now his whole life was focused on his work. But one thought haunted him. Who would continue his line? He had no wife, no children, no one to whom he could pass on the empire he had created. Oscar wanted an heir, someone who would carry on his family name and the work of his life. While he sat in his silent house, on a busy street, right on the cold sidewalk, bent over a piece of dirty cardboard, sat Lana. She carefully moved her pencil over the surface, drawing the strokes of the future drawing. Lana was only 26 years old, but life had been cruel to her since childhood. She was left homeless, without support, without hope. Lana once dreamed of becoming an artist. She studied at an art school, and the teachers predicted a great future for her. But after her mother died and her father left, her world collapsed. She had no family, no money, no roof over her head. She had to drop out of school, and now she whiled away her days on the street, drawing to somehow drown out the pain inside. People passed by, not noticing her, immersed in their own worries. Lana's pencil glided quickly across the cardboard, capturing the face of a crying woman. She did not draw for money or recognition. Her paintings were a reflection of her soul, a way to express feelings that she could not splash out otherwise. Oscar and Lana lived in completely different worlds, but fate was preparing an unexpected meeting for them that would change their lives forever. Neither of them could even imagine how much this turn of events would change their destinies. Sitting in the cabin of his elegant black car, Oscar nervously tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. He had made a firm decision. He wanted a child. He was not looking for love or marriage. He did not need affection. This was a business decision, just like the numerous deals he made every day. Driving through the city streets, he looked at the world around him through the tinted windows of his car. Crowds of people rushed about their business. The streets hummed with cars and voices, creating an endless noise of city life. He knew that in this chaos, he had to find a way to implement his plan, and he was not going to stop until he got what he wanted. Nothing around him affected him. He felt like a stranger, an observer from the outside. Stopped at a red light in the center of the city, Oscar suddenly noticed something unusual. A young woman was sitting on the sidewalk. Her head was bent over a piece of cardboard, her brown hair disheveled, her clothes threadbare. But she was not begging, not holding a sign. Instead, she was drawing. Oscar squinted, intrigued. She seemed completely absorbed in her work, the pencil flickering across the cardboard with the confidence of an experienced artist. People passed by, not paying attention, but she did not seem to care. There was a quiet strength in her concentration, as if the world around her had ceased to exist for her. The light turned green, and an impatient signal from behind forced Oscar to move. But his thoughts remained there, on the sidewalk next to the stranger. Who was she? Why was she here? And why couldn't he get her out of his mind? A few blocks later, Oscar realized he was turning into a parking lot. He sat in his car, staring at the steering wheel. "This is stupid," he muttered, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Before he could change his mind, Oscar turned around and drove back to where he had seen her. She was still there, carefully shading part of her drawing. Oscar pulled up to the curb and rolled down his window. "Hey, you," he called. The woman looked up. Her blue eyes narrowed as she studied him. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was wary but firm. "Come here," Oscar said. His tone was calm but confident. She hesitated, clutching her pencil tightly.
Why?
"I want to talk." Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, Oscar thought she would simply ignore him. But then, slowly and reluctantly, she rose to her feet and came closer. Up close, she looked even younger than he thought. But there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of a hard life. "What do you want?" she repeated, this time more sharply. Oscar paused. He realized that he hadn't thought through how to start the conversation, but he decided not to complicate things. "Get in the car, I'll take you somewhere warm, and we'll talk." The woman grinned, but there was no humor in her grin. "Tassi, do you think I'm that naive?" "So, I won't hurt you," Oscar said calmly. "I have an offer, something that could change your life, but I'm not going to discuss it on the street." She studied him carefully, then glanced at his expensive car. "Why would a man like you want to help someone like me?" Oscar looked at her calmly. It's your choice. If you don't want to, stay here. She was silent for a long time, then sighed heavily and got into the car. As Oscar drove the car down the street, a tense silence hung between them. Finally, he broke it. What's your name? Lana, she answered quietly. Oscar? He introduced himself. Lana said nothing, just nervously laced her fingers together in her lap. I'll explain everything when we get there, Oscar said. The car pulled into the parking lot of a small, quiet cafe. Oscar led Lana inside and chose a secluded table in the corner, away from the other patrons. Lana crossed her arms. Well, what's the meaning of this? Oscar leaned forward, his expression serious. I need someone to carry my baby, and I'm willing to pay you more money than you've ever seen. Lana blinked, looking at him in confusion. Are you kidding? No, Oscar answered calmly. She looked at him, her mouth slightly open. You want me to? She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I want an heir, Oscar said bluntly, leaning back in his chair. I don't want a relationship or a wife. I just want a child. In return, I'll take care of you during your pregnancy and give you enough money so you can start a new life after it's born. Lana was silent. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Lana looked at her hands. Her fingers were still clutching the edge of the table. Why me? She asked after a long pause. Oscar met her gaze calmly. I saw you on the street, he said. You seem strong. You've been through a lot, but you're still holding on. That's the kind of person I need. Lana smiled bitterly. You don't know anything about me. You're right, Oscar nodded. But I know enough to know that you're not like most people. And I think we can help each other. Lana's thoughts were racing. She didn't trust this man, and the idea of carrying a child for a man she barely knew seemed absurd. But then she thought about her life, the cold nights outside, the excruciating hunger, the endless feeling of hopelessness. I don't know, she finally said, shaking her head. This is crazy. It's not crazy, Oscar said. It's practical. You need an outlet, and I need an heir. It could change your life. Lana narrowed her eyes. Why don't you just adopt a child, she asked sharply. Oscar clenched his jaw. I want a child who will be a part of me. Adoption is complicated, and I don't want to deal with it. Lana sat back in her chair, stunned. Well, see, what happens after the baby is born? You'll be free, Oscar said calmly. You'll get the money you were promised, and you can live the way you want. No strings attached. She looked at him searchingly. How do I know you won't change your mind? That you won't try to sue me or use me in some way? We'll have a contract, Oscar said confidently. Everything will be legally sound. You'll be protected. Lana looked away. Her heart was pounding. She wanted to say no, just get up and walk away, never look back. But where? Back to the street? To the life she was so tired of? She looked at Oscar again. He was sitting quietly, not rushing her, just waiting. He didn't seem like the type to throw words to the wind. But could she trust him? Lana took a deep breath. I need time to think, she finally said. Oscar nodded. In 24 hours, I'll be moving on. Anna rose slowly to her feet, which were barely holding her up. Thank you for the offer, she muttered, not knowing what else to say. Think it over, Oscar reminded her as she turned to leave. This is a chance to change everything. That night, Lana sat in the park, looking up at the overcast sky. Oscar's words echoed in her head. This is a chance to change everything. She had nothing to lose, no home, no family, no future. But could she do it? The next morning, Lana woke up on the same bench, cold and broken. She had barely slept, turning Oscar's offer over in her head all night. The thought of being part of this strange agreement disgusted her, but the prospect of returning to her old, hopeless life seemed even worse. She took a deep breath, brushed off her coat, and headed to the cafe where she was supposed to meet Oscar, her heart pounding with every step. Pushing the door open, she saw him at the same table in the corner. Oscar looked up as she approached, his face unreadable. Have you decided, Nom? He asked calmly. Lana sat down opposite her in silence. I will, she answered evenly, although her hands were shaking slightly. Oscar just nodded, as if he had long known what her answer would be. Lana took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. You're moving into my house today, Oscar said calmly. She blinked, looking up at him, confused. Isn't that too soon? I'm not used to wasting time, he answered confidently. The contract is ready. It can be signed by this evening. It details our responsibilities. From now on, you will take care of. Lana bit her lip. And the money? Will you keep your promise? Oscar's gaze hardened. Yes. As soon as the baby is born, you will receive everything we agreed on. It will be enough to start your life anew, Anywhere. Lana hesitated. It was all happening too fast, too abruptly. But then memories came flooding back. Cold nights, hunger, the fear of being stuck in an endless cycle of survival. "Okay," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Let's go," Oscar said shortly, standing up and leading her to the car. The drive to his estate seemed unreal to Lana. She looked out the window, watching the narrow city streets give way to wide highways and spacious mansions. Finally, their car slowed in front of massive gates that swung open, revealing a luxurious home surrounded by immaculately manicured gardens. Lana swallowed. She had never seen anything like it. The inside of the mansion was even more majestic. Marble floors, high ceilings, sparkling chandeliers. All of this made her feel small and alien in this world. "This is where you will live," Oscar said, pointing to the spacious bedroom. The huge bed was made up with snow-white linens, and the window overlooked the garden. Lana slowly ran her fingers over the soft fabric of the bedspread, unable to believe what was happening. "It doesn't seem real," she whispered. "It's real," Oscar answered calmly. "Get used to it." He was about to leave, but suddenly stopped at the door. "My assistant will bring the contract this evening. Make sure you read it carefully before signing." Lana nodded silently. When the door closed behind Oscar, she sat on the edge of the bed, trying to comprehend what was happening. Everything seemed too big, too alien. This house, this deal, this new life. She didn't realize what she had gotten herself into, but she knew there was no turning back. She was now in a hopeless situation, homeless, without support. She needed the money to go back to school, and the terms of the deal were crystal clear. She would carry Oscar's child, and he would provide for her completely. After the baby was born, she would leave with enough money to start her life anew. It all sounded simple, but now, sitting in silence, she felt the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. The past weeks had passed in a whirlwind. Lana was getting used to life in Oscar's mansion, but it hadn't been easy. Despite their politeness, the servants kept their distance, and the house itself was more reminiscent of a museum than a cozy home. She often wandered through the spacious halls, feeling like a stranger among the marble floors and sparkling chandeliers. Oscar, as promised, made sure she had everything she needed, but he remained cool and distant. Their interactions were limited to small talk over dinner and discussions of her medical checkups. However, one evening, while walking around the house, Lana stumbled upon a room she hadn't noticed before. It was a bright studio filled with art supplies, paints, pencils, canvases, and easels. On the table was a small note, written in neat handwriting. "You mentioned once that you like to draw. I thought this might help you." Lana froze, staring at the words. Her chest tightened. For someone who seemed so distant, this gesture was surprisingly personal. A week later, Lana and Oscar found themselves at the same table in the mansion's spacious dining room. It was a rare moment when they both felt more relaxed. "You're quiet today," Oscar said, breaking the silence. Lana shrugged. "I'm still getting used to all of this. It's overwhelming." Oscar nodded as if acknowledging this. He paused for a moment, then added, "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" His question surprised Lana. She looked at him, then nodded slowly. "Yes, life hasn't been kind to me, but I think it's made me stronger." There was a soft glint in Oscar's gaze. "Strength is something I respect." The conversation continued, stretching into the night. They shared stories they had never told anyone before. Oscar opened up about his difficult relationship with his father, a man who always put money before family. Lana spoke about her dream of becoming an artist and how life had taken that dream away from her. For the first time, they felt equal, two broken souls finding solace in each other. One thing led to another, and before the night was over, a moment of intimacy sparked between them. Unexpected, but irresistible. Weeks passed. Lana felt that something had changed. She couldn't explain it, but a strange feeling was growing inside her. A visit to the doctor had only confirmed what she already suspected. She was pregnant. The news sent a whirlwind of emotions through her. On the one hand, it was part of their deal. But on the other, she couldn't ignore the subtle, barely perceptible attachment that was already beginning to form in her to the life growing inside her. With each passing week, Lana began to wonder more and more. Could she really leave? Could she leave the child she was beginning to love? One morning she was sitting in the garden, lost in her thoughts, when suddenly a sharp voice broke the silence. Lana turned around and saw an elegantly dressed woman standing at the edge of the garden. Her posture was tense, her gaze cold. "I'm Lana," she said carefully. "I'm Lucy," came the answer, full of hidden condemnation. It was Oscar's sister. She did not waste time on formalities and immediately made her intentions clear. Lucy doubted the reasons for Lana's appearance, her honesty, even her character. "How do I know that you are not here simply for profit?" she asked sharply. Lana felt her insides tighten, but she was not going to back down. "It's not about money," she said firmly. "Oscar and I have an agreement, and that's the only reason I am here." Lucy was in no hurry to believe. For several days, she had been carefully planting doubts in Oscar's mind, forcing him to think about whether Lana could be trusted. Oscar felt conflicted, but despite his sister's influence, he continued to spend time with Lana. There was something about her sincerity, her fortitude, that kept him from pulling away. One evening, sitting in the studio he had built especially for Lana, Oscar suddenly shared a memory. "My father never cared about me," he said, looking at the floor. "He just wanted to control me, control everything." Lana listened in silence, then quietly said, "I know what it's like to feel abandoned. My father left after my mother died too. It's hard to trust anyone after that." Their shared pain brought them unexpectedly closer. For the first time, Oscar allowed himself to relax a little, and Lana saw behind his cold exterior a man who had also been hurt. Later, sitting in the luxurious foyer, Lana ran her hand over her belly. It was just beginning to round out, but every kick inside her reminded her that new life was growing inside her. She didn't expect to care so much about her child. Lana had signed a contract with Oscar, but now she felt like she was carrying a heavy burden. She tried to convince herself that it was just a deal, but the thought of giving up her child after birth squeezed her chest. This wasn't just a child, this was her child. Meanwhile, Oscar spent more and more time with Lana. He couldn't explain why, but her honesty and inner strength made him feel at ease around her. They shared quiet evenings in the art studio, discussing dreams and fears, and sometimes just laughing at the little things. One evening, he looked at her carefully. "You've changed since you first came here," he said. Lana smiled softly. "Maybe because for the first time in a long time, I feel safe." Oscar froze, his gaze becoming serious. "You deserve it, Lana. I'll take care of you and the baby, I promise." She wanted to believe him, but there was a lingering doubt in her heart. Would he feel the same way when he knew the truth? Across the mansion, Lucy sat in the living room, holding the phone to her ear. "Find out everything you can about her," she ordered the private investigator. "I don't trust her, and I won't let my brother ruin his life for some gold digger." A few days later, Lucy received the file. Photos, documents, reports, and among them, something she knew would shock Oscar. Lana had a criminal record. The next morning, Lucy stormed into her brother's office, throwing the folder on the table. "You need to see this," she said sharply. Oscar frowned as he opened the papers. They showed that Lana had been arrested for shoplifting at age 17. There was also a report that she had once been homeless, and a note about being expelled from art school for not attending. "And what is that supposed to prove?" His voice was calm but cold. "It proves she's not who she says she is," Lucy insisted. "She's hiding something." Oscar's face went blank. "Go away, Lucy." She snorted but slammed the door behind her. "We need to talk," Oscar said, stepping inside. She turned around, her heart stopping when she saw his serious gaze. "What happened?" "I know about your past." He held up the folder. "Why didn't you tell me you had a criminal record?" Lana froze, her heart pounding. "I was going to tell you," she whispered, "but I was afraid. I didn't want you to think I was a bad person." Oscar crossed his arms over his chest. "Why did you do that?" Lana took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears. "I was a child. My mother had just died, and my father had abandoned me. I had no money, no food, no one to help me. I stole a few things to survive. It was wrong, but I had no choice." Oscar's expression softened. He saw the pain in her eyes, the shame she had carried for years. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked more gently. "Because I thought you wouldn't understand." Lana wiped away her tears. "People always see me as a criminal, someone who isn't good enough. I didn't want you to see me like that." Oscar took a step forward, his voice firm but warm. "Lana, I don't care what happened in your past. What matters to me is who you are now. And I see a strong woman in front of me who has been through hell, but hasn't broken. That's all that matters." She looked up at him, surprised by his words. "Do you really think so?" "I know that," he answered firmly. "But from now on, no secrets. I want to know everything, no matter how hard it is." Lana nodded, relief washing over her. For the first time in a long time, someone saw not only her mistakes, but also the person behind them. She stood in the garden, lightly touching her growing belly with her palm. The cool air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers, but her thoughts were far from calm. She couldn't shake off the growing feelings for Oscar. He surprised her, with his kindness, his understanding, when she expected only coldness. But these feelings scared her. Falling in love with Oscar was not part of the deal. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Lucy paced nervously in the living room, clutching the phone in her hand. The conversation with Oscar's ex-wife Jane was just beginning. Everything turned out exactly as she had hoped. "I'll be there soon," Jane said, her voice charming. "I've been thinking about Oscar a lot lately. Maybe we broke up too soon." Lucy smiled faintly. She hated Lana and didn't trust her at all, but Jane was perfect. Elegant, wealthy, and most importantly, Lucy's close friend. She was sure that Jane was the best woman for Oscar and the baby. A few days later, the house rang. Lana, who was working in the art studio, heard the sound but didn't pay attention to it until a woman's voice echoed through the corridors. "Oscar, how long has it been since we last saw each other?" Intrigued, Lana left the studio and froze. In the spacious hall stood a tall, striking woman with luxurious loose hair and a designer bag. She smiled at Oscar, reaching out to embrace him in a friendly manner. The man hesitated for a second, then his face became tense and impassive. "Jane," his voice was reserved. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't stay away," Jane replied with a warm smile. "I was thinking about us. I made a mistake leaving you." Lana's heart sank painfully. She had only heard of this woman in passing, but she hadn't expected to meet her. Jane was stunningly beautiful, self-assured, and still partial to Oscar. While Jane was chatting animatedly with James, Lucy appeared in the doorway with a smug smile. "I thought it would be wonderful if Jane dropped by," she said, casting an appraising glance at Lana. Lana felt like an outsider in this story. Days that followed, Jane felt like the mistress of the house. She spent time with Oscar, nostalgically reminiscing about the past and hinting at the possibility of a new beginning. "A child needs a mother," she remarked one evening at dinner, looking at Oscar intently. "And who better than someone who knows and loves you?" Oscar remained impeccably polite, but his detachment was obvious. He was clearly unsure of what was happening. Lana tried to keep her distance, but Jane's presence was impossible to ignore. She seemed to fit perfectly into Oscar's world. For the first time, Lana felt real jealousy. One afternoon, Jane found Lana in the garden. "So you're the one carrying Oscar's baby," she said, a hint of mockery in her voice. "Yes," Lana replied evenly. Jane cocked her head to the side, studying her. "I suppose I should thank you," she said with a casual smile. "But don't relax. When the baby's born, I'll be the one raising it with Oscar. He needs a woman who really understands him." Lana felt a knot in her stomach, but she didn't let it show. "We'll see," she said calmly and walked away. That night, lying in bed, Lana couldn't sleep. Her emotions were swirling inside her. It wasn't just jealousy. It was more complicated than that. She realized that she was attached to more than just the baby. She was attached to Oscar. "I'm in love with him," she whispered to herself in the darkness. This realization was both a revelation and a heavy burden. But what could she do about it? Oscar had been kind to her, but he had never shown any signs of wanting anything more than their arrangement. And now that Jane was back in his life, Lana felt even more insecure. The next evening, Oscar found Lana in the art studio. She was sitting by the window, looking thoughtfully at the night sky. "You're quiet today," he said, sitting down across from her. Lana sighed. "I just have a lot on my mind." Oscar hesitated before speaking. "If you think I invited Jane, I didn't. Lucy, she has her own ideas about my life." Lana looked at him, and her heart sank painfully. "I think she's still in love with you." Oscar sighed heavily, running his hand through his hair. "Jane, complicated. She left because I didn't live up to her expectations. She thought I was too cold, too distant. Maybe she was right." Oscar looked away thoughtfully. "But I don't understand why she came back now." Lana paused for a moment before saying quietly, "Maybe she sees what I see, that you're not cold. You just don't let people see the real you." Oscar met her gaze, and for a moment the tension between them became almost unbearable. Then he reached out and gently covered her hand with his. "Thank you for seeing me," he said quietly. Lana's heart was pounding. She wanted to tell him everything, how much she felt he meant to her, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, they just sat in silence, their hands still touching as the night settled over the mansion. Jane's presence in the house was like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. Every moment she spent with Oscar felt carefully planned. Every glance cast at Lana was full of disdain. Lana tried to keep her distance, going to her art studio or taking long walks in the garden, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Lucy, for her part, took every opportunity to undermine Lana. "She doesn't belong here," she told Oscar one evening. "You've done enough for her. As soon as the baby's born, send her on her way. And Jane, she's the only right woman for you. She always has been." Oscar's patience snapped. "Lucy, this isn't your decision," he replied coldly. "Don't interfere." But Lucy wasn't one to back down easily. Late that evening, Jane cornered Oscar in his office. "I don't understand why you're so stubborn," she said, leaning against his desk. "We were good together. We can be together again. Think about it, Oscar. The child needs a mother, and I'm the perfect choice." Oscar looked at her carefully. "Jane, you left because you couldn't accept me for who I am. You wanted me to be different, more open, more accessible, but I'm not that person, and I never will be." Jane winced but quickly pulled herself together. "People change, Oscar. Maybe we could try again, for the child's sake." Oscar shook his head, his voice firm. "The child will have everything he needs. If he needs a mother, I'll find her on my terms. Not because you suddenly decided to come back. I'm sorry I left, but I don't need you and I don't want you back." Jane's face fell, and for the first time her confidence wavered. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "No," Oscar said coldly. "It was a mistake to think you ever cared more about me than you could get. Go away, Jane. This house is not yours anymore." The next morning, Jane packed her things and left the mansion. Before she got into the car, she gave Lana a look that sent shivers down her spine. "Enjoy it while you can," she said bitterly. "You won't be here forever." Lana watched silently as the car disappeared around the bend in the long driveway. When Lucy learned that Oscar had sent Jane away, she was furious. "What are you thinking?" she blurted out. "Jane was perfect for you. And this," she nodded in disgust towards Lana, "is a complete disappointment. You risk everything for her." Oscar looked at her tiredly. His patience was running out. "This is my life, my child, and my decision. I will not let you interfere anymore." Lucy clenched her jaw but said nothing. Instead, she disappeared into her room, and the hatred for Lana flared up inside her with renewed vigor. Even after Jane left, Lana could not shake the feeling that she was out of place here. Paths crossed again, and though Oscar tried to be supportive, Lana still felt like an outsider. With each passing week, as her belly grew rounder, so did her attachment to the baby. She often found herself talking to the baby while she painted in the studio. But there was always a shadow lurking in her thoughts, a reminder that this child was not hers. One evening, Lana stood on the balcony, watching the sunset. Oscar came over and leaned on the railing next to her, asking quietly, "Are you okay?" She thought for a moment, then nodded. "Sometimes it's just hard. I feel like I'm the odd one out." Oscar turned to her, his gaze hard. "You're not the odd one out, Lana. Don't let Lucy or Jane tell you otherwise." Lana smiled faintly. "It's not just them. This whole situation, I didn't expect to feel this way." She ran her hand over her stomach. Oscar looked at her carefully and said, "You've been through a lot, and you've done better than most. You're stronger than you think." Lana looked at him, her heart clenching. She wanted to tell him everything, how much she cared for him, how much this child meant to her. But the words never came. Instead, she said quietly, "Thank you, Oscar, for everything." They stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The tension in the mansion was almost palpable. You could cut it with a knife. Lucy no longer tried to hide her contempt for Lana. It showed through not only in her harsh words and looks, but in her every action. Even the smallest signs of attention that Oscar showed to Lana were perceived by her with undisguised hostility. It only seemed to fuel Lucy's anger, and it was only a matter of time before she acted. One morning, Lucy burst into Oscar's office, her face flushed with rage. "You're letting that woman ruin everything." She threw a file down on his desk. Oscar looked up wearily. "What now, Lucy?" "She's playing you, Oscar. It's not about the baby, it's about your money and your name. How do you know she's not lying about everything?" Oscar's patience finally snapped. He stood up abruptly, towering over his sister. "I already told you to stay out of this. Lana is here because I decided she is. If you don't like it, maybe it's time to..." Lucy's mouth dropped open in shock. You're choosing her over your family? I choose peace over your endless meddling, he said firmly. This is my life, and you have no say in it anymore. Lucy stormed off, her heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. But she wasn't going to give in. A few days later, Oscar insisted on accompanying Lana to another doctor's appointment. Lana was nervous, not only about the exam, but also about being so close to Oscar after their quiet, almost intimate moments earlier. The doctor smiled at them and began the ultrasound. Lana lay on the exam table, clutching the edge of the sheet tightly as the cold gel touched her belly. Oscar stood next to her, arms crossed over his chest, but his eyes were glued to the monitor. There was a rhythmic thump of heartbeat. Lana smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. But a moment later, the first sound was joined by a second one, just as clear and even. The doctor beamed. Well, what a surprise, he said. You're having twins. Lana froze. Twins? Oscar leaned closer, a rare look of surprise flashing across his usually impassive face.
Are you sure?
The doctor nodded, pointing to the screen. Here's one baby, and here's the other. Both are healthy. Stared at the screen, caught in a mixture of awe and fear. 2 children, 2 lives. She had agreed to this deal thinking there would only be one child, but now everything was different. Oscar was silent. When they left the clinic that evening, Lana retreated to the art studio. Her mind was racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the twins. They weren't just part of the deal anymore. They were real. They were hers. Oscar found her there, pausing in the doorway for a moment before speaking. Twins, as if testing the word. Lana turned to him, unsure what to say. I wasn't expecting this, she admitted. Neither did I, he replied, stepping inside. But it's not bad. Lana blinked in surprise. Are you okay with this? Oscar hesitated for a second, then nodded. It changes a lot. But yes, I've spent my whole life planning everything, controlling every outcome. And this is something I didn't expect. But maybe that's what I need. Lana looked at him, feeling her heart tighten. There was something new about him, a hint of vulnerability. A man who had finally allowed himself to let go of control. Oscar, she said quietly, these children, they're more than just part of a deal to me. He met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. I know, he said quietly, and they're more than just heirs to me. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Lucy, meanwhile, was making plans. She knew she had lost her grip on Oscar, but she wasn't about to give up. She dialed the number of a lawyer she knew, hoping to find a way to challenge Lana's place in his life and, if possible, the settlement itself. Lana sat in the nursery, slowly running her hands over the soft blankets neatly laid out in the room. The room was beautiful, painted in soft pastels with toys and books neatly arranged. It was the perfect place for a child. But every time she looked at it, Lana felt her heart clench. She had agreed to it, thinking it would be a deal. But now that the twins were growing inside her, she couldn't ignore the love she already felt for them. The thought of giving them away after they were born seemed impossible. But how could she tell Oscar? He had changed lately. Although he remained calm on the outside, Lana noticed the little things. He made sure she had everything she needed, sat with her at dinner, asked about the children more often. One afternoon, Lana was walking in the garden, trying to clear her head. Oscar joined her. You need to sit down, he said softly. The doctor said not to stand for too long. Lana smiled. I'm fine, Oscar. You worry too much. Someone has to, he said quietly. They walked together, and for the first time, Lana felt like she was more than just part of a contract. She felt cared for. A week later, Oscar insisted on accompanying her to her next doctor's appointment. Lana was nervous, but she didn't argue. The doctor began the ultrasound, and the room was filled with the rhythmic sound of 2 strong heartbeats. Lana felt tears welling up in her eyes and instinctively reached for Oscar's hand. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, he squeezed her fingers gently, his eyes never leaving the monitor. They're strong, the doctor said with a smile. You have 2 healthy babies. Lana turned to Oscar. She saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Emotion. Oscar walked beside her as they left the clinic, unusually silent. When he reached the car, he stopped and looked at her. His expression became serious. Lana, he said quietly, I need to tell you something. She looked at him, her heart beating faster. It started out as a business arrangement, he began, his voice hesitant. But things are different now. I didn't plan this. Lana's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. But somewhere along the way, I realized that I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. I didn't expect it, and honestly, it scares me. But it's true. She held her breath looking at Oscar. He took a step forward, his eyes searching hers. You changed everything, Lana. His voice was even, but sincere. I can't imagine my life without you and these kids. I want more than just an agreement. I want us to be a family. Lana felt tears trickle down her cheeks. She laughed softly, shaking her head. I've been in love with you for a long time, Oscar, she admitted, her voice shaking. I just didn't think you'd ever feel the same way. Relief washed over Oscar as he pulled her into a tight hug. You don't have to worry anymore, he whispered. We'll figure this out together. In that moment, Lana felt her fears begin to recede. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. The days following their confession were filled with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Lana felt like she truly belonged in Oscar's life now, and he felt like he had dropped the walls he'd worn for so long. They spent more time together, discussing the future. One evening, sitting in the nursery, Oscar spoke up. I want to be more present in our children's lives than my father was in mine. He ran his hand along the wooden headboard of the crib, his eyes thoughtful. I don't want them to grow up feeling like they don't matter, he admitted. My father was obsessed with work, with control. He saw me as an extension of his dynasty. I don't want to make the same mistake he did. Lana took his hand. You won't, she said quietly. The very fact that you're thinking about it shows that you'll be a great father. Oscar smiled faintly, but there was still fear lurking deep in his eyes. The labor had started earlier than expected. Lana had been feeling uneasy all day, but she had chalked it up to the usual pressures of late pregnancy. By evening, however, the discomfort had turned into a sharp pain. Oscar found her in the living room clutching her stomach. It's happening, she gasped. He sprang into action, calling the doctor and rushing her to the hospital. The drive was tense, but Oscar held her hand, his calm masking the storm of emotion inside. Everything happened quickly at the hospital. Lana was taken to the maternity ward, and despite the staff's pleas to wait outside, Oscar was adamant. I'm staying, he said firmly, not letting go of her hand. The hours that followed were intense, with cries of pain alternating with words of encouragement, moments of silence that seemed endless. And then finally, the first baby cry cut through the air. Lana burst into tears. It's a boy, the doctor announced, holding the tiny wriggling body. Before they could process the moment, there was a second cry. Here's your girl, the doctor smiled. Lana was exhausted but overwhelmed with joy. As the babies were wrapped in blankets and handed to her, she felt a love so deep it was almost painful. Oscar stood next to her, his usually controlled expression softened with awe. He reached out, gently touching his son's tiny hand, then his daughter's. They're perfect, he whispered. Later that night, when the twins were moved to the observation room, Oscar sat by Lana's bed. She was resting, but when she opened her eyes and saw him, she smiled tiredly. You did amazing, he said quietly. So did you, she replied. Oscar hesitated, then looking down admitted, I'm scared. Lana frowned. Are you afraid of being a father? Oscar nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can handle it. What if I let them down? What if I make the same mistakes my father made? Lana reached for his hand and squeezed it tightly. You won't let them down, Oscar. You're already showing that you care, that you want to be there for them. That's what's important. Oscar looked at her, his eyes shining with emotion. I don't know what I'd do without you, Lana. You gave me something I didn't even know I needed. Lana smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. And you gave me family, something I never thought I'd have again. Oscar leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. We'll get through this together. The mansion was no longer quiet. Now it was filled with the cries of children, laughter, and the melodic ringing of life, a warmth that had been sorely lacking before. Oscar and Lana were adjusting to their new roles as parents, experiencing sleepless nights and early mornings together. Lana had never imagined such a life, but she felt that everything had fallen into place. Her days were devoted to caring for the twins, and in the rare moments of silence, she would secretly draw while the babies slept. Oscar, despite his initial fears, quickly settled into the role of father. He was attentive, protective, and most importantly, deeply in love with the family he and Lana were creating. Lucy avoided them in the first weeks after the twins were born. She was angry at Oscar for rejecting her opinion and for kicking Jane out of their lives. But one day during a surprise visit, something changed in her. She walked into the living room and saw Oscar rocking his daughter, gently lulling her to sleep while Lana sat nearby, feeding their son. A simple yet touching scene. Later, when Oscar was alone, Lucy approached him hesitantly. "I was wrong," she said quietly. Oscar looked up in surprise.
"What do you mean?"
Lucy sighed. Lucy sighed, her voice quieter than usual. "I see now that you've created something beautiful, Oscar, and I'm sorry I tried to ruin it." Oscar studied her face carefully, then nodded. "Thank you, Lucy. It means a lot to me." She turned to leave but hesitated. "If you ever need help with the twins or anything, I'll be here." With Oscar's encouragement, Lana began sharing her work again. He helped her connect with galleries and collectors, and soon her paintings began to gain recognition. One evening, she returned home from an exhibition, exhausted but radiant. "They sold 3 of my paintings," she said with a smile, holding up a receipt. Oscar came closer, his eyes shining with pride. "I'm so proud of you." He held her close, and Lana closed her eyes, savoring the moment. Joining motherhood with art had not been easy, but she had never felt more fulfilled. She had a family, a career, and a future that seemed truly bright. One evening, when the twins were already asleep, Oscar asked Lana to come out into the garden with him. The moonlight was softly illuminating the space, and Lana smiled. Everything around her seemed magical. Oscar was holding a small envelope in his hand. "Do you remember this?" he asked, showing her the contract she had signed months ago. Lana nodded, her heart beating faster. "That's how it all started," Oscar continued in an even voice. "But it means nothing to me now." He tore the contract in half and let the pieces of paper fall to the ground. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I don't want a contract between us," he said, dropping to one knee. "I want love. I want you, Lana." He looked at her with such sincerity that it took her breath away. "You've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. Will you marry me? Not because of the twins, not because of the agreement, but because you're my love." "Because I love you," he finished. Tears streamed down Lana's face as she nodded, barely holding back a happy laugh. "Yes, Oscar, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and the next moment their lips met in a tender kiss under the stars. Their future was no longer sealed with obligation. It was now sealed with love. A few weeks later, Oscar and Lana stood again in the same garden where he had proposed. This time they were surrounded by family and friends, and their twins sat nearby, dressed in tiny, identical outfits. The ceremony was simple but filled with warmth. Lana glowed in a flowing white dress, holding a bouquet of soft pink roses. Oscar, elegant in a tailored suit, kept his eyes on her. "I promise to love you, to support you, to build a life with you," Oscar said, his voice even but his eyes filled with emotion. "And I promise to be there for you, to cherish you, to love you with all my heart," Lana replied. As their lips met again, there was applause, laughter, and cheers. Even the twins giggled, as if understanding the significance of the moment. In the months that followed, their lives settled into a harmonious rhythm. The twins grew up amazingly fast, filling the house with laughter and joy. Lana devoted her days to caring for her family and her art, her career gaining momentum. Oscar put things off more and more and spent more time at home, enjoying every second he spent with his wife and children. One evening, they sat on the terrace, watching the sunset cover the sky with golden light. Lana rested her head on his shoulder. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Oscar hugged her, smiling. It's more than I could have ever hoped for."